Today is traditionally known as Palm Sunday. When we think about the triumphal entry, as I thought about it, I thought the not-so-triumphant entry. That was one candidate. The other candidate for my talk today is donkey business. But I've actually gone for the not-so-triumphant entry, when Jesus entered Jerusalem for the very final time. And it was clearly a hugely significant event because all four of the gospel writers include it in their accounts. And when all four of them have the same things in their accounts, you have to put your ears up and think this is important. They're not mirror images of one another. And most add a detail or two to their account, their version, which are very distinctive. But if you blend them, you get a remarkable kind of a joined-up jigsaw, a picture of what happened on that remarkable day. Jesus has been on the way to Jerusalem for some time, very intentionally, and now he's in the final furlong, the final lap, as it were. He's almost there. He's heading from Jericho to Jerusalem, an uphill journey of some 15 miles, and the road over that territory climbs some 3,000 feet between the two places. At a pace, you could cover that distance in 6 to 8 hours on foot. But let's read how Matthew records the day. And we start actually in Matthew chapter 20. Now, why start in chapter 20 and not plunge straight in where Jesus enters Jerusalem in chapter 21? Well, what goes before is really key to what happens next. If you read through the Gospels, most of the time, Jesus is telling people who he's healed to keep quiet about it, not to tell other people about it. He tells his disciples that things he's telling them are basically for their ears only. Revelation seems to be constantly on a need-to-know basis. But at the end of chapter 20 that we read first, something happens. As they walk to Jerusalem, two blind men get to hear that he's on his way. And they stand by the road or sit by the road and start shouting, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." And of course, when you and I read it, we probably do so without batting an eyelid. And we don't really pause for thought. But any self-respecting Jew at the time would have known who the Son of David was and what that was referring to. He was to be the final king, the ultimate king of the world that God would send. And this time, Jesus does not correct them. He doesn't silence them. He just says, "Yes, what do you want me to do for you?" And if you were one of the disciples walking with Jesus, this would have been an eye-opening, stop-in-your-tracks stuff moment. Jesus is answering deliberately. He could not have misheard the blind men. He is answering to the title, the ultimate King of Kings. It is, believe you me, a wow moment. And it clearly has an effect on the crowd around him. Because as chapter 21 picks up, they take it over. They pick up the blind men's language. Now, Luke, interestingly, has them pausing outside Jerusalem at the villages of Bethany and Bethpage. John has him staying overnight at the village of Bethany, and it's during that dinner that a woman anoints his feet with perfume and dries them with her hair. You may remember that account. And if you read further back, Bethany is where Mary and Martha and their brother Lazarus live. And not long before this, Jesus has raised Lazarus from the dead, and now Lazarus is walking with the crowd with them on the way to Jerusalem. Point is, Jesus was very familiar with this neck of the woods. He knew those villages, and those villagers knew him. All of which makes actual sense of what happens next. When Jesus approaches Bethphage, he sends two disciples ahead of him to get a donkey. If anyone was to say anything, they were just to say that the Lord needs it. And it makes sense. Because anyone in those villages knew Jesus. Anyone in those villages had probably seen or met Jesus. Not long ago, he raised someone from the dead in those very villages. I grew up in a village. I expect that was the most thrilling thing to have ever happened in that village, ever. So if someone untied your donkey and said the Lord needs it in one of those villages, no one was going to object. They would have known the Lord who needed it. So it makes sense at a basic level. And it makes huge sense on a prophetic level. Because as Matthew quotes from Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9, it says, "Say to the daughter of Zion," which is a catch-all phrase for all who lived in Jerusalem, "See, your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." So Jesus was fulfilling a specific Old Testament prophecy. Why does he have to ride on a foal, on a young donkey that hadn't been ridden, hadn't been broken in at all? Well, it had to do with the idea of purity. He was riding an animal untainted by anyone else ever riding on it. It was suitable, if you like, for sacred purposes, in the same way that sacrifices at the temple back then had to be only of perfect animals. But if any of you are in the slightest bit horsey, which I don't mean that you look like a horse, I mean that you know about horses and all things equine, you have probably thought, like I've thought, rather you than me, Jesus, riding a donkey that's never been ridden before, without a proper saddle, all through that crowd, shouting and hollering and waving palms. If ever there was scope for an animal to get spooked, it was surely then. But good old Luke gives us a great little detail. He tells us the disciples brought 2 donkeys. And in actual fact, it would have been very sensible to have had a young donkey and its mother, because the presence of the mother would have been a natural reassuring and calming presence for the young donkey. I love the detail in the Bible. But I'm not too sure that at that moment the disciples were loving it. You see, they cannot have failed to have noticed how Jesus was engaging with the blind men, how he was blatantly allowing himself to be publicly called Son of David, the ultimate king. And they were heading right towards Jerusalem, the royal city of Israel's kings. They must have sensed that this was it. Whatever it was, this was it. You can't do that and expect no one to notice. The toothpaste would never go back in the tube. Jesus was acknowledging, allowing himself to be described as the absolute ultimate king, with everybody there listening and knowing. There was no going back now. This was going to be an entrance like no other. I expect the adrenaline was surging through the disciples at that moment. They thought, oh my goodness. And they knew too, this was going to be do or die. Because either Jesus was going to enter that city big time, big style, or he'd be absolutely crushed. You could not wander around saying stuff like that for long. There were going to be consequences. And this was an age of triumphal entries. Look at images on Roman ceremonial arches or Trajan's column in Rome, and you'll see emperors and generals with prisoners and plundered booty returning to Rome in glory. The nearest equivalent, when I was thinking about it, that in my lifetime, that I can remember was the return of HMS Invincible and the task force from the Falklands. Some of you were probably not even around back then, but I can remember it was just when I was coming to the end of my school days, or in the middle of my school days then. But that's the nearest thing that I can think of, that return of the task force. But even local Roman governors would have had a formal ceremonial welcome along the lines that Paul was talking about in terms of Herod arriving at a different gate. But they would have involved gleaming white stallions. So when Jesus sends for a donkey, I can imagine some glances being exchanged. Because if you really want to make a triumphal entry as a king, donkeys just don't cut it. That would be a parody of a triumphal entry, a pantomime triumphant entry, in fact. So what's with the donkey business? Zechariah says, "See, your king comes to you, gentle, riding on a donkey." It was a paradox. Donkeys were for servants and baggage, not kings. And if you are on a donkey, you don't really have much chance of being anything other than gentle. But frankly, if it gets into a stubborn mood, you might be standing still for ages. It's not the sort of image that would drive shock and awe into your opponents. You'd be better off on foot on the battlefield than on a donkey. But there is something deeply vulnerable about this donkey business. And therein lies the key. The people have got it wrong. They serve Jesus' purposes really well, but not intentionally. They think Jesus is serving their own purposes. They've hijacked Jesus, if you like. They've made him the mascot for their nationalism. They think he will set them free from Rome. And I wonder if we often make Jesus the hero of our cause and are less concerned about his cause. You see, they are cheering a fantasy. Within days, they will be so disappointed, they'll be shouting, "Crucify." Jesus' cause was never to set them free from Rome. As one commentator put it, no Romans will be conquered this week. Rome was small beer. Being set free from Rome was a sideshow. Jesus had come to set them free from sin and death. That's his agenda. And there was only one way that he could do it. Not just them, us, you and me. There's only one way that he could do it. It could not be accomplished on a war horse. Jesus came as the Prince of Peace. And critically, the peace that he came to bring was between us and God. And the problem that had separated us and God was sin. And I love what Tim Keller says. He says this: "Sin is when servants put themselves in the place the king should be. Salvation is when the king puts himself in the place where a servant should be." Sin is when servants put themselves in the place the king should be. Salvation is when the king puts himself in the place where a servant should be. It was the only way. We are saved by weakness, not strength. So, Jesus borrows the donkey, doesn't he? It was the prerogative of a king to requisition, to commandeer property, but Jesus was no ordinary king. In Luke chapter 9, Jesus says, "Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." And in truth, when I thought about it, Jesus was always borrowing. He was born in a borrowed stable, born literally in a manger borrowed from livestock. He was constantly borrowing other people's houses, other people's dining rooms, for him to teach them over dinners and lunches and all the rest of it. Now he borrows a donkey, and by the end of the week he'll be crucified on Barabbas' cross and buried in Joseph's tomb. Question: what is he wanting from you? The fact that the Lord needed it was sufficient for the donkey's owner, probably a poor farmer type, to let it go, no more questions asked. Would the fact that the Lord needed it be enough for me? Would it be enough for you? What is he asking of you? Is he wanting to use your voice to people in your workplace or in your family or in the community in some shape or form? Is he wanting your hands to serve other people at church or in the wider community? Is he wanting your time? Is he wanting your money? Would the fact that the Lord needed it be enough for you? And if not, why not? What is he wanting from you? So Jesus gets on the donkey and heads towards Jerusalem for a head-to-head confrontation. He is effectively claiming to be king, the ultimate king. It is game on. The ball is in play. And a very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut palm branches, very typical behaviour with royalty around at that time. And the crowds went ahead of him, and those that followed shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David, Hosanna in the highest, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Now note, because I confess that I've always had an image of him going to Jerusalem and then the crowds erupt with all this stuff. But actually, this is before Jesus even gets to Jerusalem. Jesus is actually choreographing the proceedings. He deliberately allows himself to be hailed as Son of David by the home crowd, as it were, the villagers from Bethany and Bethpage. They've not long seen Lazarus hop out of a tomb 3 days after he died. It would not take too much to get those guys cheering. And as they approached Jerusalem, there would have been thousands of people camping on the roadside on the Mount of Olives. It was the feast of Passover, and Jerusalem's normal population of around 50,000 would have exploded to maybe 100, 120,000 people. And they were camping on the roadside, in the fields, in the open air. And they were in festival mood. And you can imagine the crowd's joy and mood was infectious and spread as Jesus heads up into Jerusalem. It was no spontaneous travel plan. Jesus has planned this to be as loud and as in your face as possible. No wonder the whole city asked, "Who is this?" Luke records the Pharisees in the crowd demanding that Jesus rebukes the crowds. John says that the Pharisees said to one another, "See, this is getting us nowhere. Look how the whole world is going after him." It was nothing like a true triumphal entry. It was not the triumphal entry I believe the disciples hoped for or anticipated, but it was precisely the entry that Jesus had hoped for. He knew what he'd done when he healed those two blind men. He knew what he'd allowed them to call him, what he'd chosen to respond to. And he knows nothing of this will be lost on the Pharisees. It was the biggest stick that Jesus could find to rattle their cage. What Jesus is doing as he rides into that city is brazenly saying, "Crown me or kill me." He's giving them no other option, and they know it. By the end of the week, they'll have made their choice. Zechariah's prophecy says, "Your king comes to you." Not has come, not will come. He comes. He still comes to us. And he's still saying the same thing to us on this Palm Sunday. Crown me or kill me. He's not interested in us or anyone else calling him good. He's not wanting us to lump him together with all the rest, yet another good spiritual leader. He's not wanting us to look upon him as our spiritual guide and guru, a source of wisdom. He's not wanting us to talk about him as our counselor. He's not looking for us to just like him. It's crown me or kill me with nothing else in the middle. Our King comes to us again this Easter, And that is his challenge. Crown me or kill me. Father, we confess that it's easy to sing about you being our King. And we confess this morning that the reality can be very different. We acknowledge before you, Lord, that our intention when we sing that is not to sing a lie. That's what we want to do. That's what we believe. That's what we want in our lives. But we confess the reality, the nitty-gritty, the wattle and weave of day-to-day life when other things seem so important and culture around us tells us to put priorities on different things. It's such a hard thing to do. And it's so easy to displace you from the throne and put other things there instead. And this morning we confess because we realize that when we do that, it kills you. As you think about this week, we know there was pain and heartache and tears in heaven as Jesus the Son died on the cross. And the Father looked and watched. And Lord, we know that there was anguish in Jesus the Son as he asked if that cup of suffering could be taken from him because he knew so well just what it would cost him. And yet he did it. He did it all for us. So when we don't put you on the throne, or when we sing empty words but our lives don't match them, it kills you. And we, like those blind men, ask for your mercy. We ask for your forgiveness. And all God's people said, Amen.